What does it look like this right now? Cold enough for you? Okay. All right. So to begin today, I do not have any disclosures. I have received funding to conduct some of the research that I'm going to be talking about today, but I've received no salary support for doing that. All right, so with all education presentations, we have three objectives that we want to go through today. First, I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson, okay, and a little bit of background into the study of reflection, both the art and science of, or more the art, I should say, of reflection. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about experiential learning, where our knowledge of reflection comes from, talk about reflective practice, actually through some existing frameworks that have recently been developed, and then finally talk about some practice-based learning tools to promote reflective learning. All right, so this is actually going to connect with a bit of what Emily had talked about before, about how when we are designing tools and implementing tools, that often we'll have to actually go back to the tool itself to refine, not just look at necessarily the process of implementation. All right, so let's start off with our first objective here, which is a bit of a history lesson. All right, so one thing that wasn't actually mentioned in my introduction is that I actually identify myself as a cross-millennial. And I just found out about this at NAPCREG and FNM.
You're the least cross person I've ever
Well, a cross-millennial refers to, I probably am going to live half my life in the 20th century and half my life in the 21st century. This fellow right here was a cross-millennial too, but he lived half his life in the 19th century and half his life in the 20th century. Anyways, now Darlene can't answer this, Sheena can't answer this, but any idea who this fellow might be?
Is this Flexner?
Oh, looks a bit like Flexner, but nope.
Osler.
And some of the, similar to Osler, but nope, not Osler either. Actually, John Dewey, okay? And John Dewey, okay, was an American philosopher and educator, right? And a lot of his work we can credit around reflection and thinking. And what he examined was sort of the difference between sort of this basic human element that we have of being able to think and being able to think well, right? How can we actually operationalize our thinking and organize our thinking, right? Which is a very important part of reflection. So, all right, he actually used the term reflective thinking, all right, to describe this concept, all right, of critical reflection. Right? And reflective thinking gives learners the opportunity to sort of plan and describe their own experiences. And do we believe that if a person was not critical, right, of her ideas, it would not essentially be reflective? So when we reflect, all right, we are looking back on our experiences, all right, in an organized fashion. And today, we really have two concepts, one of reflection and one of reflexivity. You've probably heard of these two concepts. Reflection is certainly the examination of how we think, what's happened, how we perceived an event, and we relive that event in our mind, pinpointing a place and time where something is missing. So for example, after today, after this talk, right, I'll reflect on it, right? How did it go? How do I think you perceived things? Was there something that I missed in my presentation that I had prepared but I didn't convey to you? Reflexivity, right, is similar, but it's about finding strategies to question our attitudes, right? Not just our attitudes, but our environment, the complexities of a given situation. So it's a little bit more than just reflection. Now, what Dewey did, all right, is he came up with this reflective thinking and theory of inquiry. All right, and it starts with a given situation that you have. Within that situation, you come up with a question or a problem that's arisen from the situation. From that question, you develop a hypothesis, and then you actually reason through it and finally test it out. And this is a model that started over 100 years ago and has been adapted, all right, over the last 100 years. So now I'm going to share with you, all right, some older views of critical reflection, and then some newer views of critical reflection. All right, first person here. Anybody recognize who this might be? Okay, Donald Schoen. And Donald Schoen really helped us to conceptualize what critical reflection was all about. How we how we think reflectively. All right, he coined the terms reflection on action and reflection in action. Reflection on action, of course, is when we reflect back to our current events, all right, our current actions. All right, so in a clinical setting, you look at your interaction with a patient, you reflect back on it. What we want to try and instill in our learners and to be able to develop is the reflection in action, where we are reflecting on the fly. So if you're interacting with a patient, right, you're recalling as you are doing this interaction, past interactions, past experiences, and building on that information as you go. Right, so that was Donald Schoen. The second person here, right, Stephen Brookfield. He wrote a great book on the critically reflective teacher. And essentially, he had 4 principles. Right? The first one is of self-reflection. And he used the term assumption hunting. So previous experience as a learner, all right, influence how we work. The second point he makes is around student experiences. That as a teacher, we need to teach through our learners' eyes. Right? In other words, we need to teach to the level of our learners. Right? And the second one, of course, is around peers. Sorry, the third one, around peers. Excellent teachers look to peers for mentors, for advice, and for feedback. And finally, the last element that he explored is around scholarship, and that's about engaging with colleagues and literature that supports teaching. Right, so he is very influential, all right, in the critical reflection literature. Now, the third person I want to teach here is the late Dr. Karen Mann from Dalhousie University. And what I really credit her for is highlighting the importance of critical reflection in medical education, particularly workplace learning. Right? She critically examined the assumptions of knowledge and experience that Brookfield stated, right? to help us achieve sort of a deeper meaning and understanding of how we think and reflect. And finally, I think the torch has really been passed to Dr. Stella Ng at the University of Toronto. And her work is to look at sort of the complexities within healthcare, right? Health system, society at large, and she uses these theories, these prior theories of critical reflection and reflexivity, right, to sort of explore their interconnectedness. All right, so she's really moved beyond reflection to talk about reflexivity. All right, so really interesting work that she's doing. Now, what I'd like to do now is to look at the work of Anton Kolb, right, who, as you can see, he came up with this Kolb's learning cycle in the 1980s. And actually, you can see many similarities to Dewey's work, right, at the turn of the century. All right? Whereas essentially, you have a given experience, all right? You reflect on that experience, it develops new ideas, new questions, and you work and you test them out. Right? So this is a very common learning cycle, right, that we use in education. It's very individualized. Right? A lot of critics of Kolb's learning cycle would say that it's not collaborative enough. It doesn't involve more than one individual. It's too individual focused. All right. So that is essentially a brief history of critical reflection. Right? Looking at Dewey's work, moving on to Brookfield, Schoen, all right, and then also I wanted to put in the Kolb learning cycle here because this leads me to this next piece around experiential learning and a framework that I helped to develop. And it's all based on Kolb's work in the 1980s. All right, and that's going to be the eConsult framework and the Canadian Practice Information Network. And that's a project that I'm working on with Bill Hogg and with Sharon Johnson. All right, eConsult. I think we're all familiar with how this operates, but if not, just a quick synopsis. It's a secure software program that allows a primary care provider to ask a clinical question, essentially in the form of an email, really, right, that gets sent to a specialist provider. Specialist provider will be able to give a response and send it back to the primary care provider. Sometimes there's an exchange between the two providers, right? Sometimes not. The provider can also upload an attachment, right? It could be a lab report, it could be a photo, right? If it's a dermatology question, all right? To aid in the specialist making a response. So essentially, that process happens, and within 7 days, often much less, the specialist gets a response. So originally, of course, this was identified as an access to care solution. But very quickly, we realized that there were many educational opportunities that are afforded from this process. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. I'd like to talk about one of those educational opportunities. All right, so let's go back to the Kolb framework. All right, that concrete experience that Kolb talked about, obviously this is the patient interaction that the primary care provider has. Right? A question comes from that observation, that interaction with the patient. Right? So that's where that eConsult question gets generated. Right? Then we have this piece of abstract conceptualization. All right? It's the interpretation of the eConsult response. All right? right? So when that question gets sent, you get the reply back, all right? The primary care provider has to interpret all that information, all right? And then the act of experimentation, right? That's where you actually have to implement that response. Or it may trigger a further question back to the specialist, right? It's all part of this active experimentation phase. And then it moves in a cycle, because then you're either able to apply that information to a new patient, or you start the whole process again with a new question. All right, so that's applying Kolb's learning cycle to eConsult. So that led us, actually, to helping develop a framework. And this is one that we had published last year in Academic Medicine. And it's a 4-level framework on experiential learning. Right? So it all starts with the primary care provider, reflective practice-based learning. Right? Moves into the discourse and reflection. So this is all part of the Kolb learning cycle. Right? But then we move out of the Kolb learning cycle. Right? Remember I said the critics of that cycle are that it's very individualistic. Well, now we move into other realms, which is about creating relationships and rapport amongst providers, which is very interesting, because many times, right, the primary care provider and the specialist will never meet. Right? Yet certainly relationships develop. Right? So that's an area that has really yet to be explored, but will certainly be done in the near future. And then finally, all right, how can we apply all this learning, all right, for program planning and maintenance of certification? All right. So what does this look like? All right. Well, where providers frequently identify gaps in their knowledge, all right, this is when that question is being asked. All right. So the whole idea here, to link this back to critical reflection, is you need to take these elements of knowledge and make sense of them. Right? Because essentially that's really what critical reflection is all about. Right? Taking experiences and knowledge and being able to make sense of them. All right, this next level within the framework, all right, this discourse and reflection, all right, it's about facilitating learning around specific patients through direct interaction between the primary care provider and the specialist. And that, of course, leads to the next piece about building rapport and relationships. Right? You're more likely to engage in new models of care when there's an opportunity to develop personal relationships and gain respect. Right? And I think that is really starting to come through in spades. All right? And I think the time is prime right now for looking at these relationships. And then the next piece here is around program planning and maintenance of certification. And this is really sort of the core of this project that I'm going to explain about in just a second. But before I do, all right, there's another project that's going on in parallel with this study with the console, and that's the Canadian Practice Integration Network. Now, essentially, what this is, all right, it's adapting information and exchange learning infrastructure for practices and patients to fuel continuous improvement. It offers performance data to guide decision-making and resource allocation, and enable research related to family medicine. So what does that actually mean? All right. Essentially, it's software that is implemented into the into the scheduler of the EMR, right? And it allows providers to send to their patients a health promotion message, all right, as well as a series of a number of survey questions they would like their patients to answer. Okay. And the success rate of this in prior work has actually been very successful, 60 to 70% success rate. Then what the software does, once that response from the patient, which is either sent as a text message or as an email, all right, the software then puts that information together in a report. And then that report can be used by the provider for quality improvement and possibly even professional development. All right, so those two projects, the eConsult and the CPIN, all right? Now we're looking at tools that are used for these two programs. All right, so I bring you back to the COLD framework, right, which we just talked about. All right, and now talking about this Stemler grant that Simone had introduced. Kevin.
I just have like a question to go back to the previous slide.
Yeah.
What if there's no real reflective observation? Like, this is what can happen in practice where you do referrals, and that's why you refer, because you really don't want to think about it. So you just refer. And then how does that impact your future, like, I guess, expertise as a family doctor? Is if you're, and I saw this in Toronto, so I guess this exists. So people just refer everything, and they don't observe about anything. So I don't know if you could comment about that in terms of, because e-learning has the same problem.
Then it stops, right? As we'll see in sort of feedback that I received, part of this study is developing these reflective tools for the specialist and for the primary care provider. They'll take you through a series of questions. And if you don't feel that there is any learning that's been had, questions stop. That's the end. How this really came up was with the specialists. Because we feel, and a lot of the feedback has, which led to the development of the specialist tool, is that when you ask a question, if the specialist can answer that based on their prior experiences, just off the top of their head, they do, that stops. Like the tool doesn't get implemented. However, every once in a while, you'll ask a question where the specialist will have to say, I don't know. Right? They'll have to go down the hall and consult with the subspecialist, or they'll have to look it up themselves, right, and try and find an answer for you. In that case, there is learning. Right? So what these tools do is they actually take you through a step-by-step process of documenting that learning. Okay? So to answer your question in short, it would stop. If you're just doing it for the purpose of referral, you don't go through the cycle. Right? It sort of stops here. Okay. Oh, sorry. So on this grant, now Rachel Grant, who is a PhD student of mine, she talked a bit about this this project last spring. All right, I'm just going to update you on the progress. This is a 2-year grant, and we're just into the 2nd year of this grant right now. But it's quite an accomplished team that we've got together here. Okay, just to identify, Craig Campbell, all right, is the professional development lead at the Royal College. Jeff Sisler is his equivalent at the College of Family Physicians Canada. We have people from the American Board of Medical Specialties, Mira Irons and David Price, as well as Scott Shipman from the American Association of Medical Colleges. We have sort of the eConsult equivalents in San Francisco. That's Delphine Chuo and Justin Sewell. All right. They operate the e-referral program there, which is similar to eConsult, a little bit different. And then we have some other investigators here, Tim Wood, who's a methodologist here at the University of Ottawa, and of course Claire and Aaron, who are the specialists of primary care leads for eConsult, and Roland Grad from McGill, and Emily also mentioned Roland. He's involved in this program as well, because the premise of these tools initiated with his work on the IAM assessment tool. And this is the tool that's used for info poems. So physicians in the group would be aware of that program, where you receive an info poem and you do a quick reflection on that to get microcredits from the college. So this is where the beginnings of this tool start. All right. So the idea here is to document for providers to be able to document and reflect on their learning from eConsults, and number two, to provide specialists with feedback on their consult responses. So to get this ball rolling, it happened about a year ago, we had a research team which was pretty comprehensive in terms of their expertise around eConsults and also around professional development, together in a room along with some other users of eConsult and eReferral, both specialists and primary care providers. And we took a look at this IAM questionnaire, which had already been validated, and really worked to say, okay, how can we now take this tool and make it applicable for eConsult and eReferral? So there was a lot of discussion and back and forth during this meeting and then through email to actually develop what we thought would be a sound, reflective tool for eConsult and eReferral. But that's not good enough. Right? You can have a group of experts together to develop a tool, but how can you ensure that it's actually going to be used in practice? So this is where we did a Delphi, all right, with both Canadian primary care providers and specialists and US primary care and specialists, all right, to see if this was actually a useful tool for them. All right. And so we had a number of participants partake in this. And we actually did 3 iterations of the tool, of the primary care tool and the specialist tool. But and this is what the tool looks like here. So actually there's only 7 items on it. Some of these items are detailed, but it actually takes you through the learning process, what the question is, what the learning is from it. This is the feedback portion, improvements to the specialist response, application to patient care, anticipated benefits, shared patient outcomes, all right, and then sending the feedback back to the specialist. And this was an important element, because often from the specialist point of view, they don't know what actually happened to the patient. Right? So this is sort of being a possibility of closing the loop.
Doug, does the provider have to fill this survey in after every request?
Okay. How this is working, and I can see that my presentation is stopped.
Yeah, the program's a little bit slow, so
okay.
have to give
well, we'll wait. How it's intended to be used, and we're just about to pilot it now, Bill, is that when a case is closed, when an eConsult is closed, the primary care provider will get a prompt to complete the survey. And so they will go through the process, and then it gets submitted to the system. For the specialist, they'll get the prompt for the tool once they've sent the clinical response. And they'll decide at that point, is this, was there any learning that was done? All right, or was there not any learning that was done? All right, so what we anticipate is before we did we're just about to roll the pilot, but in our testing phase, all right, we're getting the feedback from specialists that, just as I said before, it's not going to be for every consult that I complete, but it's going to be for some of them. And the whole idea here is once this is all said and done, both colleges in Canada are going to look at this to see, okay, this is going to be worth a certain amount of credit, right? And it'll be valuable credit too, because there is interaction between providers. So there is that sense of group learning that goes on. Those are sort of the valuable credits that you, as providers, you want to be able to get.
So you're seeing it on your screen. It's
Yeah,
just not
but it's
projecting.
it's down to one bar right now, so
It's okay.
The program's just quite
All right.
slow.
So
You've done that
essentially,
before, Doug.
for this study, for this study, we've just completed a testing phase, and this is where providers, both primary care providers and specialists, go. Well, what they did is they look back on prior consults they've already done, and then they completed the tool. And the feedback, this is really important, because in the Delphi, we didn't get consensus on all items. Right? So with a Delphi, if you take a really hard approach to that, you discard those items because you didn't get consensus on them. But the expert committee said, well, these are really good items, all right? But what we found is when we sent this out in the Delphi, it was in a format which is kind of like a paper survey, where you see all the different options laid out. So the overwhelming feedback from providers was, this will take too long. But when we actually tested it out, it wasn't in the paper format. It was actually in the electronic format. And they said, oh, this doesn't take any time at all, right? And so there was much more acceptance for it, right? So this gets back to, do you revise the tool, all right, or do you revise the process, right? So in this case, there was a lot of feedback where we restructured the tool, but we didn't actually remove the questions. Questions, clever, yeah.
Really interesting, right? Because actually there are two drivers here. One is that both the primary care provider and specialist get paid for this exercise, right, by someone who is not perhaps interested in them, whether they found it useful or reflective or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And is there a risk that they could turn around and reduce the cost of that if actually there's a second driver?
Oh.
Line, right?
That is interesting.
You're going to get credit for it, you know?
That's right. And again,
But maybe it's a bonus for you because they may perceive that part of getting paid is continuing exercise.
This is actually a good question, right? It's really worth exploring, because what you're getting at is intrinsic motivators and extrinsic motivators. And what is really driving the consult and the response? Is it an extrinsic motivator or is it intrinsic? Right? After this piloting phase, we're actually going to have interviews. All right, we'll actually look at that to see if one is more prevalent than the other, or maybe my guess is that both are at play. As you're getting that, but certainly we want to explore those intrinsic and extrinsic motivators. Bill.
Have you considered sending the survey requirement or option to the family doctor and specialist maybe 1 out of 6 times that they do a referral rather than every single time? I think that I understand why you want them to reflect on what they're doing, but I question whether or not they need to reflect every single time they use the service.
Yeah. I think right now with the pilot, it's just those that have consented to do it, and they've consented to do it over a period of time for each consult that gets done. All right? But that'll only be over a certain period of time. Certainly the feedback, and this will come through the interviews, will be whether it should be done for every consult or, as you say, like every 6. That'll certainly come out. For sure. Camilla.
Interesting idea. Do you foresee any barriers with respect to participant consents for this? Because when people are using the service, their intent is to use it for the purpose of answering this clinical question, not necessarily to engage in reflection, achieve credits, etc. So how would your, or provide data for research, for example. So how would your consent process, what would it look like once you actually enroll this?
Yeah. Well, the consent process for the pilot, all right, that's sort of outlined. Like this is sort of the purpose and the intent. If and when this actually gets implemented for real, right, and we'll have to wait till the end of the study to see if that actually does happen, right? You would get a prompt whether you want to complete this, this assessment, and there would be that piece there, it's worth so many credits for you for doing it. You can choose, it'll be built into the system, and into the e-consult system or the e-referral system, and you'd have that choice of clicking on the button or not. All right, so that's how the consent would work. All right, and of course, if you did click on it, you would see a preamble as to what's going to happen with this. Because part of it will be, a big part for the primary care provider will be at the end, like the specialist will actually be able to see what happened with that patient, or what the plan is for that patient.
I really want to applaud the fact that you're moving what is seen as a sort of access to care service to a learning reality. It's always been true that family doctors learn a huge amount from the consultations that they send to specialists. And it's so much better than going and attending some kind of course where somebody lectures at you, because it's totally related to a problem that's in front of you where you need expert assistance. So it sticks, the learning sticks, and it's just actually the ideal point in which to learn something. So I predict that there won't be any great problems with family doctors agreeing to participate in this additional aspect, because I think they all see it as a learning opportunity most of the time anyway.
Bill, thanks for saying that. This is certainly the direction that the field is moving in. When I say the field, it's the professional development field. Both the Royal College and the College of Family Physicians is looking at professional development in a movement that is part of a learning continuum, right? From the time that you're a medical student to the time that you retire. And learning happens continually. And to adopt principles of adult learning, right, it needs to be meaningful, authentic learning that you're doing. And that means practice-based learning. So this is one mechanism, right, for getting at those needs, both your perceived needs and your unperceived needs. All right. And so what'll happen is you'll actually you'll have a database of these questions. And again, if you go through the reflective process, you can say, okay, I'm asking a lot of questions in this area. Maybe this is where I should be directing my future learning.
I agree totally. I think it's also got something to do with stickiness.
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing to learn something because you've read something or you've been at a lecture and it kind of is floating around somewhere in your brain. It's quite another thing to have it tied to a person that you're caring for. I absolutely, on many occasions, have had learned something that relates to a specific person, and then a year and a half later, somebody comes in with the same question, and I've forgotten most of it, but I know that I've been through this before with this particular person, and I go into that person's chart, and there it is. So it's just like the way things are stored, at least in my mind, and I think this is true for everybody, just, you know, the way human beings evolved with social interactions and so on, is that a lot of our memories are tied to people or to particular events or something like that. It's not, and that's not what happens when we're in a lecture. So that, yeah, I think this is a fantastic opportunity for learning, for teaching and learning. Just ideal.
Thanks. And also I think it gets, to that point, that I talked about before, Schoen's work, the reflection on practice and reflection in practice. Right? As you do more of these, hopefully that will be in your mind and you'll be able to draw upon it as you're actually engaging with the patient real time. So that's sort of the hope. Esther.
I agree, it's a fantastic tool, and what amazing data you will get from that. And that would be very interesting to look at. I was wondering, was there any specific condition that prompted you to think that way? What happened in a discussion that you're like, maybe we should ask those additional questions? Like you have already some survey questions, but they're not reflective, and that's fascinating, especially because you also asked the specialist. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the auspices of this, honestly, this gets back to probably, really when I first started here around 2011 or so. There were a number of lectures on professional development that there needed to be a change. There needed to be a move from professional development being at conferences, being on the cruise ships, et cetera, where you're sort of sitting in the seat as you're doing now, and someone just sending information, telling you what you need to know. Right. There's a movement to being more practice-based, which this fits to. There is a movement to being more interprofessional, more team-based rather than very individual-focused. There was also a movement towards learning that was more tailored, all right, rather than sort of a general movement. So that's really where it started, so then it was kind of a natural fit for eConsult to move in this direction. Hope that kind of answers your question.
I don't really have a question as much, but I know that you said you had visuals and results to show, and I think that we're good to go on this. I think we.
Okay. Do we have time?
A couple minutes if you want to show us. I know you have plenty of.
Okay. Yep. So that was the primary care profile. Yeah. So as I said, we didn't get consensus on a number of items. The specialist tool, okay, similar in the fact that it all starts with the question. Defining whether the question was clear or not, moving into resources that were consulted, all right, and finally the learning and application of learning. If you're interested in this, I can show you details of what these questions actually are. These are sort of the main constructs of the tool right here. But again, there were items that we did not reach, that did not get consensus reached, and some of them, like sharing the patient outcomes. All right. I think this was just a matter of having to clarify the question that was being asked. So again, it was revisiting the tool, not necessarily the process. All right. So in the testing phase, we're going to have, we're just finishing that up now. We'll probably have about 12 participants that went through it. Overall, they now understand that the tool is useful and they liked it. But again, they just wanted some clarification on some of the tools. So this is really important before it goes out to piloting, that it's going to be something that is acceptable. So over the next few months, we've got 8 registered so far. We're going to build that up to 12 in Canada and 12 in the US. And then we'll do the qualitative interviews in January, February. And this is sort of the neat part. We're going to be reporting this at a meeting at the Society for Academic Continuing Medical Education in the US. And we'll sort of have around the table, we'll have a group, the research team, plus members of that community that are both researchers and accreditors, right, to share this information. Right? And then Then hopefully they'll move to the next step in the US for making this part of their maintenance of certification. That's the hope. And then we'll also do that in Canada in April at the Canadian Conference for Medical Education. Again, this will be a closed meeting where we invite researchers in the areas of reflection and professional development to sit around a table with the team, as well as the accreditation folks as well, to present this information in hopes, again, of moving it towards professional development. Just quickly, the CPEN part, this is a project called Canhart Code, all right? And what it is, what's kind of neat about this, it's getting at what Emily spoke about with this tool around patient engagement, all right? Kind of a similar piece where we'll get providers and patients together to talk about questions specifically around cardiovascular disease prevention. To develop questions that providers really want to know about, but also that patients feel that they'll be able to answer. And so we get together in a room, we develop these questions for CPIN. Right? Canhart has already taken on an educational endeavor to put together a package of patient education materials. Right? These will form the messages, and then this group will get together and we'll use what's called a nominal group technique, right, to develop those questions together. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the nominal group technique, it's a consensus technique, much like a Delphi, but you do it with a smaller group in a room. And what's interesting with it, too, is that everybody has a full voice. So it all starts with everybody pitching their own ideas, and no idea is thrown out. All right? So providers have equal input as do patients. And then you go through a process of combining like items, and then finally tossing out items that people don't rank highly, until you get a manageable list together. All right? And that's a process that will take 2 to 3 hours. All right? And in between, we bring in the literature, what's already been done. So this CFP article that Emily mentioned in her study, right? We'll actually look at those questions. You know, these are patient engagement type questions. All right, to see if we want to include any of those or not, or to see whether they have been repeated or not. So it's kind of a neat process for coming to consensus around developing questions. And that's what that study is. It's basically just to get people together to develop those questions. I won't get into that question, but that's it. Any final questions? Heidi.
Just the CPIN is the first time I've heard of it, so I don't really know what that is. But if you do something where you bring patients and I really like that idea of bringing a patient into it. You bring patients and providers together, and the idea is to identify questions that will help you structure content that will then get pushed to provide to patients for learning objectives. Is there any intent to do the reflective learning on the patient side at that point, a little bit like you're doing with e-consult? Because you can push content to a patient, but it doesn't mean that there's going to be any uptake. Is that part of the CPIN process, or am I completely in left field?
Yeah, no. I think you're onto something here. I think the original intent with CPIN, right, is these are provider questions that they want their patients to be able to answer. All right, and this hopefully will lead to practice improvement because they'll get a report of the patient responses.
So that way they can target some of the education that they want to provide, or?
Well, it depends on the questions. There's a
I see,
whole
okay.
cadre of questions. Right now, for this project, it's just developing cardiovascular questions that providers want to know from information that providers want to know from their patients. All right? And it could be a select portion of the panel of a provider's practice, all right? Or it could be everyone that was seen over the last 6 months. All right, it depends on the question. And the provider will be able to pick those questions, right? Sort of, it'll be tailored, right? They'll be able to pick questions. So maybe they want a cardiovascular question. Maybe there'll be another question they want to know around patients as well. Bill, anything to add?
The CPIN service is obviously designed to enable reflective learning by providers, getting information from a whole bunch of patients that's aggregated before that feedback is given to the provider. So I mean, that's all good in terms of quality improvement infrastructure, but truly it's not as powerful as linking it to a single patient.
No.
So I think in that respect, the e-consult approach is going to have more impact. Or at least it's in a different space.
Yeah. Whereas it's aggregated. You're right.
Yeah, because the feedback from CPIN is made anonymous on purpose.
That's true. Yeah. So it will be more tailored. Yeah. But that's interesting, to get patients to reflect.
Any other questions?